Good afternoon, colleagues. This is Learn Extra Teacher Talk, and my name is John. It's my pleasure to welcome you. Today we're focusing on mathematics, the teaching of mathematics, dealing with issues that are relevant for mathematics teachers. First thing we're going to start off by is examining what Learn Extra has to offer in terms of our learners. We know the program runs during the week and on the weekend, but let's just have a quick overview of the schedule that's coming up for our learners. So Learn Extra for learners deals with grade 10s, 11s and 12s, and they have a live phone-in on social media show that begins for grade 10s at 4 o'clock. Grade 11s is at 5 o'clock and grade 12s is at 6 o'clock. Those are hour-long events where learners can learn together, do a bit of extra learning, revision of what they've been doing in class. And so that's our primary thing here. We're wanting to help learners to get the opportunity to improve their learning, and so they can get a little bit of extra help when they're not at school. We're not here to replace teachers in the classroom, but we're here to support each other so that together we can promote good teaching and learning. Now on the weekend, we have a program for grades 12 on Saturday and grade 10 and 11 on Sunday. And the time slot doesn't just cover mathematics. Well, let's point it out. Here's the schedule. Grade 12, Saturday, we start with mathematics at 9 o'clock until 10:30. This is a revision session where we're dealing with topics that they have dealt with, not necessarily in the past week, but they've dealt with sometime this year. Then we've got follow that up with a science program, a life science program, and a maths literacy program, just to alert you to the fact that some of your learners who do accounting and geography, please let them know that that's coming up very soon on a Saturday afternoon for grade 12 learners. We've had many requests for that, so we've scheduled it coming in June. On Sunday, we're still just dealing with the 4 subjects. Mathematics time slot stays exactly the same, except that there is a repeat of the weekday live program between 3 and 7 o'clock in the evening. At the moment, that weekday live program will be repeated for the grade 12s until we get into accounting and geography. So look out for that. Let your learners know about it. These Learn Extra sessions are meant to be interactive. And so there are a number of ways that learners can contact us, talk to us, and be aware of what we're doing. And the first way is to phone us on our phone number, studio phone number 086 1058 262. That number is manned during the shows, and we will take calls and try and assist learners. It can also be used for ordering DVDs and other materials. During the time that there isn't a live show, it goes to a recording and we'll pick it up. If you can leave your contact details on that message, particularly if you can leave us an email address, we'd appreciate it. Then the email is the other way for learners to get hold of us, for anyone to get hold of us. Helpdesk at Learn Extra. Any help that you require, whether it's about getting a problem solved or a suggestion, please send it to helpdesk at Learn Extra and we'll get hold of that. And then the next thing is to interact with us on Facebook. And for learners, that's facebook.com/Learn Extra. That page is really popular, lots of interaction, and I'd encourage you to get your learners to go to the page, not only to ask questions, but to see if they can help other learners. And that's how people are learning in this environment on social media. And then we have a teacher talk page, Learn Extra Teacher Talk, and we'd like to suggest that you go to that page, have a look at it, see if you can make some contributions. We'd love to hear from you. We'll take your messages and respond to them. Okay, now what's the focus of today's session? Well, today we're going to be looking at something that I know a lot of people are starting to think about. It's the middle of May, and or towards the end of May, and we know that the mid-year examination period is just around the corner. So how do we deal with exams, and what are some tips that we can take note of? And I know that exams can be a stressful time, both for teachers and learners, and so we'll take a look at two aspects of examinations. First of all, the setting of examinations, some guidelines about that process, so that you can understand it and you can develop from it. You can share some ideas about setting of exams. And the next thing is preparing learners for the exams, because we don't just want to teach them in class, but we do want to see them perform in the exam. So what can we do from an experience point of view to assist learners to get through this hurdle? Well, we'll find out more about that, but let's first of all go to a short break. Welcome back, colleagues. Today we're dealing in Teacher Talk, we're dealing with mathematics, and our focus is on that important part of the teaching and learning process, the part of formal assessment. Coming up for the mid-year exams in June, and I thought it would be useful for us to share some ideas about examinations and the role that examinations play both in the lives of teachers and learners. And there are two aspects of this topic. We want to focus on both of them. Initially, let's look at examinations from an education point of view. Why do we have exams? Is it necessary? And there's a lot of debate around that. And what's the process of that? We'll come to some of those philosophical questions a little later. But let's begin by outlining the fact that exams are a reality, and that in talking about examinations, we need to make sure that we learn and grow from these. Examinations and the setting of examinations for teachers is probably the one area where it can promote professional growth and development. And I'd really like to encourage you to take the opportunity and take advantage of the opportunity that every exam setting session provides to learn more about how to set and ask a good question, and secondly, how to interpret how your performance as a teacher has gone through the year. So it's a good opportunity to allow some reflection to take place as well, where we can learn so much about our teaching from looking at how the learners have answered. So what's the process of setting exams, and what are the key building blocks that need to be in place? Now, different schools will organize themselves differently. Different districts will organize themselves differently. But basically, the fundamental processes are very similar, no matter where you're at. All that I can suggest to you, if you're a head of department, is to get your staff involved in the process of setting of exams. And if you can work collegially, collectively, you'll find that you're sharing experience and you're sharing knowledge, which will lead to growth and development. So the first steps of exam setting, I think, are important to identify. And we'll go to those over here, and we'll recognize that when we set an exam, the first thing to do is to identify the topics, and secondly, we need to identify the weighting required. Now, when we talk about weighting, we're meaning how many marks each of the topics should be allocated. So if we're looking at, for example, the grade 10 learners, it's important for us to recognize grade 10, following the CAPS document, CAPS curriculum, are going to be writing exams in the mid-year, probably for the first time. These are serious, they're in a different phase of education, and of these type of exams, they haven't written that many. And so there's going to need to be some discussion about how you deal with the grade 10 learners. The CAPS document lays down some requirements. First thing we're obviously going to do is to look at the plan that we've got in the CAPS document and have a look and see what the requirements are. So to identify the topics for grade 10, if we go to the CAPS document, you will recognize that in the first two terms that we've covered algebraic expressions, exponents, number patterns, equations and inequalities, some trigonometry, and then we've covered some functions, trig functions, and Euclidean geometry. Then there's the section on the mid-year exam that takes place from week 9 through to week 11. But this week is probably in most schools going to be a revision week, and we're coming up to that quite soon. So if we're thinking about the exams, we want to cover the sections that have been dealt with in the term, not only in term 2, we want to spread the weighting as much as we can to get it in line with the weighting at the end of the year. And so if you take a look down on the CAPS document in the planner, it begins to identify that at the end of the year, the learners are going to need to face two 2-hour exam papers, and they're each going to be 100 marks. 30% on algebra, 10% on numbers, number patterns, 30% on graphs. Now, if you take a look, you'll recognize that 15% financial growth and probability hasn't been covered in this set of topics that we've looked at. What we do have is some trigonometry that's been covered, and we've also covered Euclidean geometry. And so we need to have a composite of this weighting. The weighting for the June exams is not specified. All the CAPS document does do, and we'll have a look at it, is that it does specify that you should, at the end of term 2, have a formal exam, and it gives you options. It says to you that you can either do one 2-hour paper for 100 marks or two 1-hour papers for 50 marks. Now, my suggestion to you is that, bearing in mind that grade 10s have probably only written short papers, that it's not a bad thing to prepare them to write a 2-hour paper. It is also more convenient in the setting of the exam timetable to have one 2-hour paper than to have two 1-hour papers on different days. It just makes the streamlining of the process so much easier. Having done that, the document doesn't specify how much should be on each topic, but you want to get a fair distribution, recognizing the number of weeks that have been spent. So we don't want to overload the exam paper on the algebra and the expressions section, and we don't want to underweight it on the Euclidean geometry, where you've spent a comparable amount of time. So I would suggest that it's important that as a department that you sit down and that you discuss the weighting and divide the weighting of that exam into realistic, sufficient weightings that will cover all the topics that have been done in the term time. Now, sometimes we find that learners have struggled with a particular section from class, and it might be important to make sure that those sections are focused on in the final exam, because we know that the weightings for the end of year paper are set, and we need to make sure that those focus areas remain focus areas as required. So recognize that you have a choice here within your school of either one 2-hour paper or two 1-hour papers. If you have two 1-hour papers, it does get the learners used to the fact that you could be writing a trig and geometry paper, and the other paper would be on the algebra and the expressions. I still think that a 2-hour paper is probably going to be the one that is most effective, so that learners can also get the idea that they could integrate and move between sections, that we're not compartmentalizing our knowledge as much as when we write two different papers. The June exam is an opportunity to look for an integrated type question. And that brings me to the next section, or the next idea that we're going to need to define. And clearly, planning here is critical. In all the processes of setting exams, we need to recognize different levels for questions. Recognize that the CAPS document spells out for us stages of levels, starting with knowledge, and then we're going to talk about procedures and routine procedures. Let's just pick it up. I want to just make sure that we've got it correctly spelt out in front of us. Just pull it down so that we get to the right page. And there we go. Routine procedures. Now, what you can see here is that it allocates for us not so much the allocation of topics, but the allocation of difficulty. So what we're looking at is knowledge should take 20% of the exam paper. Routine procedures should take 35%. That gives us a total of 55% of the exam paper should be accessible to most learners. And then we come to more complex procedures, and the last one, the 15%, is going to be on problem solving. And so in this CAPS document, it outlines for us those 4 levels of difficulty, depending on where we're dealing with learners. So when you are meeting as a department, I believe it's really important for people to discuss. Bring class tests, bring assignments, bring questions, and say, well, what do you think this question is? Is it a level 1, a knowledge question, or is it a level 2 where it's doing routine procedures? We want to make sure that our learners have those fundamentals in place. But colleagues, we do also need to get to the complex procedures and the problem solving, those innovative questions where we really are showing learners can have the opportunity to demonstrate their unique way of thinking. So again, I remind you that the CAPS document gives you examples of each of these levels. And I'll just go through a couple of them very quickly so that you've got them. So when we're talking about knowledge, remember, what we're talking about is recall, identification of the correct formula. Now, remember here that another specification is that in grade 10 and 11, in terms of CAPS, no information sheets should be given. And so learners are required to learn formulae. They're required to learn those things that would normally appear on a data sheet or an information sheet. They need to use mathematical facts. Right, now we're going to move on, and I just want to highlight the routine procedures require learners to perform things that, like factorizing and solving equations. Make sure that they've got those in place. Right, so when we look at questions and we look at setting exams, please make sure that you've got some knowledge questions, that you've got some routine procedures, that you've got some things that deal with complex, and that you've also got some problem solving. And not only that there should be some, but it should be in the right proportion, so that we know that learners, that the paper is fair for the learners. Now, the next part of setting exams is the one that I find the most interesting and the one that is the most challenging. Yet, there's an easy solution. The first thing is that we're going to say, when we're looking at exam paper questions, we want to collect questions. This should be an ongoing task. Taking questions from different sources, not just from a textbook, but sharing of exams, sharing of class tests. And that comes back to the fact that if you're in connection and you have a community of practice, and you're in relationship with maths teachers in other schools, then you can share very easily. So locally, share exam papers, share tests, work together on compiling documents, collect things where people have said, well, this was a really nice idea, it didn't work, but actually we could modify it to make a really interesting exam question. There are also websites where people have posted exam papers and questions that are not only referenced here in South Africa, but are overseas. And it's not a bad thing to go and look at some of those. It's very easy to take a look at some of these papers from other parts of the world and adapt them and modify them to our particular syllabus. So there's a collection process that I believe starts when you begin teaching. And it might even be a learner that gives you a really good idea for a question because of the way they've answered a question. And then you change the numbers, change the context of the question, and you'll end up with a really interesting question. Then, having done that, you've got a whole lot of questions, you need to collate them. And I believe, again, the setting of exams within a department is a collaborative exercise. And so it obviously depends on what the head of department, the HOD, has prescribed, but I believe to get as many people involved in the setting of exams, that doesn't mean in one paper, but I believe in a school, we should be making sure that everyone has the opportunity to contribute to the setting of an exam paper at a different level. So this term, it might be my turn to coordinate the setting of the grade 10 exam. But I might be assisted by one or two teachers. And it's very important that even the first year teachers have a part to play in helping to set exam papers, because we're teaching them, we're mentoring them to become more effective teachers, because it highlights as well within the exam what are the misconceptions, the common misconceptions that learners face. And so this is a teamwork exercise. It will require some discussion and it requires extra work. It's not about just copying and pasting. And using last year's exam, I really don't believe that's a good idea. We should be adapting and modifying dependent on the level of the learners that we've got. We might have an exceedingly good bunch of learners who've performed very well through the term. And so we want to increase the challenge for them and make sure that they are up to it. Testing an exam is meant to raise the bar. And if we don't just keep on recall, keep on simple stuff, we're going to find that they face the final matric grade 12 exam and they haven't been tested. Testing is going to require some strain. It's going to require some pressure. And the better we test them now, the better we prepare them for that final unknown, the matric final exam. Now, once the questions have been collated, I believe that the next part that we need to focus on is the preparation of the memorandum. A paper should never go for moderation before there is a decent marking memorandum. And in this marking memorandum, there should be a discussion about the alternative options. We should indicate all the options, the optional solutions. And that's why I don't think it's a good idea for one person to set an exam, because there really need to be a range of what's acceptable, and we need to make sure that we indicate the mark allocation for each of those methods so that there is a fair accounting of the way that things are marked. When one looks at having collated the exam and you've done the memo, please don't take it for granted. Oh, well, a similar question was for 5 marks last year, so we'll give it 5 marks this year. That's the problem with cutting and pasting. Often what happens if you cut and paste from a number of different exams, what will happen is that you get an exam paper that is skewed, that has too many difficult questions, too few easy questions, or the other way around. And so I really want to challenge you to consider and to check the mark allocation, to check the levels, to make sure that we've satisfied a range. The other thing that is important to say here is that as you're checking, there are obviously other things that you need to check. You need to check that the marks add up. They need to add up to the correct total, and you want to pay particular attention to the setting out. Now, here's the big challenge. In the old days, we used to have people that would handwrite exam papers and somebody else would type them. Today, there's the expectation that most teachers are computer literate. And so the challenge is in typing a maths paper. And so the typing of a maths paper is a big challenge. The sooner you start, the bigger database you're going to get. So the more papers you type, the more questions you've got, and the bigger the opportunity is for you to share those different type of papers. If you're struggling with that, the Maths Portal is a website, which I'll show you a little later on, that gives tuition and tutorials about how to type maths paper questions. And it's a really interesting project that they run workshops as well for teachers, and they share their exam papers amongst themselves as well. So I would suggest that you get hold of that particular website. Now, the next idea is that having done the setting and the accumulation, and it's a team building exercise, we come to the idea of moderation. Now here, the moderator needs to be a senior person. But there's no harm in a senior person reading through a paper, together with somebody who's new at teaching and explaining what they're doing. This mentoring role is part of professional development. And so whenever you get the opportunity to read a paper, whether you're reading it before it goes for moderation or not, or after, there are some critical things you need to check. And some of those, it's not just the way that it's typed. Please don't check just the typing, or are the things all centered, do the marks all add up? All of those are important. So the levels, the weightings, the criteria are important. The language is incredibly important. We need to make sure that the questions are asked clearly, that they're not ambiguous, that they're not too long-winded, that learners reading the question know exactly what the instructions are, what they need to do. The level of difficulty is probably the key thing here. And together with that, the memo. When you're assessing an exam paper, you need to look at the question and the way that the mark has been allocated to that. Now, in the final report or after a paper's been moderated, this requires a little bit of time. And I would suggest that having moderated a paper, the paper gets back, there need to be detailed comments given to the person that's responsible for finalizing it. At this point, it's no longer a team discussion. Having come back from moderation, the person that was charged with the responsibility to set the paper needs to take that full responsibility. And they need to finalize it. They need to apply the suggestions and the apply the changes. Just correct that. Apply the changes from the moderator. And then they need to print a copy. I believe that this is the important thing. You print a hard paper copy, a hard copy, and then before you print multiple copies, leave it for a day or two, and then sit down and do the paper. And it's amazing what you will see when you're doing the paper. Not on the computer screen, because your eyes have got used to it. You aren't seeing the faults. You'll pick up many of the typographical errors. You look for typo errors, and you look at for where not enough information has been given. You look for missing information, and you also look for ways to assist you in drawing up the memo. So you do the paper. You need to do it with a stopwatch. Now, you won't need the full time allocation. Roughly, if the paper is a fair paper, if it's a 2-hour paper, a teacher doing a 2-hour paper should do it in less than half the time. If it's longer than half the time, then the paper is too long. And that's an important criteria that one needs to bear in mind. And obviously to make sure that you've got that opportunity then to make the corrections. Have another discussion with the moderator. Once the paper has been finalized, you produce the final memo and you send the original paper for printing. And then it goes to the exam officer and it's locked away and it's kept safe until the day of the exam. But please remember that it's really important that the final paper that's printed is the one that is used for the memorandum, for the marking memorandum. Because often there are small changes that are made right at the end. Please make sure that the memo includes and reflects the questions for the paper. Often the other trick and looking at a paper is to make sure the numbering is correct. And I didn't mention that and I meant to. So in moderation and in checking, check on numbering. It's something that's overlooked quite often, and it can be very disconcerting and very frightening for a learner facing an exam paper and the numbering goes out. So it might seem a small thing, but please be particular and pedantic about checking marks and numbering to make sure things are neat. If you align things very carefully on a computer, there should be no reason for numbering to be out, and it should be very clear that everything has got a mark and it all adds up. Okay, well, I hope that's helped some sort of sense of setting an exam. I've enjoyed every time I've had to sit an exam or moderate an exam paper, and I've learned a lot from the suggestions that my colleagues have made, because sometimes I'll come with a particular aspect on a question and they'll say, well, perhaps you've not quite got the whole idea yourself there, so let's try and modify it and to improve it. And so out of setting an exam, my understanding of the mathematics has grown, as well as how best to examine that particular concept in mathematics. Okay, now we've dealt with the exams as far as teachers are concerned. The other aspect of exams is, what do the learners think of the exams and the exam process? Well, our role as teachers is not only to set the exams, but to support learners in the writing of exams. When we come back after the break, we're going to take a look at exams from a learner's perspective and what our role as teachers, as educators is in assisting learners to cross this important hurdle. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back, colleagues. This is Learn Extra Teacher Talk. Our focus today is on mathematics, and in particular we're dealing, with the setting of exam papers. Not only from a teacher's perspective, what about learner's perspective? We've dealt with setting exam papers from a teacher's perspective, but now what about examinations from a learner's perspective? And there's some key points that I believe that we're needing to take a note of. Exams can be a very stressful time for learners. Many learners say to me, well, we understand the work, we can do the classwork exercises, and we can do the textbooks exercises, but when it comes to exams, we sometimes just simply go blank. We're not able to answer the exams as best as we can. So we've got somebody or a number of people that we're teaching who actually are not bad at mathematics, but because of not being trained to get over the fear of exams, the anxiety of exams, they're underperforming. And so what are some of the rules, what are some of the guidelines that as teachers, as mentors of our learners, that we can pass on to them so that they can not only perform so that they can perform to the best of their ability, and they can overcome this imposition of a block towards exams. We really want to improve performance. We've got to assist them not only in the hardcore skills of what's the maths. We've got to try and help them with the soft core stuff as well, the personal development, the growth, and helping them manage things like time management and planning. And really, when we think about exams, those are the crucial issues that we need to recognize and learners need to know. And so the first thing that I would suggest to you is that as you're talking to your learners about exams, it's a very good sense to recognize that they need to plan. And planning is not something that comes easily or natural. And so there needs to be a plan towards the exam, and a study timetable is required to help learners to stick to a plan, to make sure that they're in the process of revision. Now, it doesn't matter what grade you're teaching, 10, 11 or 12, at the moment there's a current section of work. But learners should, at this stage, a month before the exam, be in the process of starting to revise on a regular basis topics that were covered earlier in the year. And so the study timetable needs to be a long-term one. Learners say to me often, well, you know what, you can't study for maths. That's not true. You can study for maths. You can focus your attention on different sections. And remember that, as we've said, this is important information that needs to be conveyed to learners as well, that 20% of the exam is going to be on straightforward knowledge and recall. And so learners need to commit things to memory, and they need to do that in a structured way. So there needs to be a long-term process. It can't be not just the night before. Before the exam, because if they leave it too late, they're not going to be able to cope with the quantity of work that's required. They're going to need to go slowly. They're going to need to go slowly and steadily. And the reason for that is that they can then ask questions. they can identify areas, problem areas, and they can ask questions. So I would strongly encourage you to get your learners together and design as a class activity a study program that will run through the term with them. So from this week through to the exam, topics that they need to study for and how much time they need to spend on each of those topics. Now, there are a number of different ways that learners will study mathematics. But I believe that it's important that we, as mathematics educators, give some good guidelines in terms of study techniques. It's no good thinking that learners can just open their textbook and read it. To me, that doesn't make sense. They need to summarize. They need to be writing down, and they need to be practicing problems. They might want to write notes in point form, or they might want to do, so they could do lists, or they could do mind map, where they link concepts in a creative way. Not all students will learn in the same way. So it's important that we give them the opportunity to make their own notes, but they need to be active. It's not just about reading and hoping it will go in. They also need to do practice examples. This will help with the routine type questions, the routine procedures, where they can write down how to factorize a trinomial. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do that. Step 3. And the maths textbooks are full of those sort of examples. Learners need to engage with this, and so that when they see a similar sort of problem in an exam or test, they're able to go step 1, step 2, step 3. And I've understood the procedure, and I can apply the procedure in a routine fashion to a particular problem. But that's not where our emphasis and focus needs to be. We want to get to the complex procedures, where it requires some additional thought, and where it requires some problem-solving skills, because 45% of the paper is going to be on that. So even if I get 100% for the basic stuff, I'm only going to get 55%. Need to make sure that I can access some of the more complex procedures, and the process with that is just keep on doing some maths. Really believe it's important that learners practice maths every day. If they don't, they become stale, their minds become numb. It's like going to the gym. It's something that we don't like to do, but a little bit of exercise every day is really good to build muscle. It's good for the sake of our health. And it's no good trying to cram in a 3-hour session at the gym and hope that's going to catch up. It's not going to help. What we need to be doing is slow and steady, a little bit every day, and in that way we package the material as well. The more often you review stuff, the more chance it has to go into long-term memory. Whereas if we try and cram stuff in, it's in short-term memory and it's not able to be accessed when learners need it in an exam. Now, the next thing that I think that we as teachers have a critical role to do, and that is to make sure that learners know the breakdown of topics and the allocation of marks for those topics. So when we talk about algebraic expressions as a topic for grade 10, we need to explain to learners what that involves, that is going to include factorizing, it's going to include products, and it's going to include fractions as examples. So we need to make sure that they understand what we mean when we say, oh, it's 30 marks on algebraic expressions. So be quite general, quite specific, in fact, about what each of the topics are that are going to be addressed. What sort of questions learners are going to need to face in the exam. It's quite difficult if you've been setting the exam paper not to give them too much assistance or not to give them too little. We need to be fair. We need to structure it. And so as a department, I believe it's important that the breakdown of what's in the exam needs to come from the head of department. And they need to say, this is the information that learners must be given. The topics and the mark allocation. And that will allow the learners to focus their time on deciding, well, because trigonometry is going to count 30% of this exam paper, I want to spend an extra time on the trigonometry because it's been a weakness of mine in the past and I'm going to make sure that I correct it. Now, in the light of the exam timetable and also of the breakdown of work, I would suggest to you that it's important that teachers, as teachers, we provide our learners with revision worksheets and exercises. These can be in addition to homework. These can be in addition to what's being done in class at the time. Getting learners into the habit of a weekly revision program helps them to stick to their study timetable as well. So we're going to be revising Term 1 work this week, and we're going to be revising trigonometry next week, and so on. Here's a worksheet to go and do. If you finish the worksheet, there's another one waiting for you. Incentivize the learners to make sure that they have the option to choose more work. Now that might sound crazy, since when have learners wanted to do more work? But you'll find that if you make the offer available to them, you'll be surprised how motivated some of them will be. I've taught learners who've come to me and I haven't been able to keep up with them. And at the end of the day, what did they get for the final exam? They got in the high 90s and some of them even got 100%. And so it's important that we encourage this sort of work ethic. Ask for more exam questions. Ask for more revision questions. And so if that's the message we're giving to our learners, they will respond and they will take responsibility. We need to recognize that they need to they have the responsibility to do the work. To do the work. It's not a bad idea to suggest to them to get study groups. There's nothing wrong with them doing revision exercises together. These aren't revision exercises for marks. They're revision exercises for preparation for the exam. Just a note on previous exam paper questions and tests. I believe they're essential to give to learners, but learners need to be shown how to use them. And so, for example, they can either sit and do an exam in the time that's required with the time allocation for each question, or they can take a collection of past exam papers and say, for example, if we're dealing with grade 12s, only do the calculus questions in an attempt to improve their calculus. The final thing that I want to just make mention of is that learners need to be used to the fact that if they're using past exam papers to copy from a memo is cheating, and it's not going to help them to learn. They actually need to do it, check the memo, and get used to marking their work so they can see where they've gone wrong. If they can't understand the memo and they can't relate their answer to the memo, then they can ask for help. The final thing that I want to say in the last few minutes of this session is that it's necessary for us to help, particularly the grade 10 learners, to develop their exam technique. We've got these learners for 3 years in the FET band, and exams are a key focus of this phase. They're writing June exams and end of year exams. We really need to give them the structure of the exam, so they need to know ahead of time how to manage time. Lots of learners that I know and that I've dealt with over the years have had the maths knowledge or even the science knowledge, but they haven't been able to complete the question in the time allocated. So they've done, for example, in an exam paper of 10 questions, they've done the first 4 questions or 5 questions really well, and they've left out questions 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Whereas they were easy marks, so they need to allocate time and they need to know how to keep to time and select questions. They need to know how to do that. They need to practice the selection of questions so that they can finish on time and they can do the best they can possibly do. They also obviously need to be prepared in terms of having the correct equipment, and they need to know what's going to be given to them. So grade 10s and 11s need to know that if they're doing the CAPS document, they're going to need to make sure that they know the data sheet. Okay, now colleagues, we've come to the end of the session. I hope that some of these ideas will be things that you can take in for yourself. will help you in your professional development and growth as either a head of department or as a teacher. Doesn't matter how long you've been teaching for, but setting exams is a great challenge and is part of our growth as educators. The next thing is we need to get the learners motivated. And so giving them a structured planned program for the setting up of exams is going to help them to do their very best. If we can be their mentors and help and guide them, they will surprise us in their performance at the end of the day. And so I hope this has helped you. From me, John, it's been my pleasure to be with you on this edition of Teacher Talk. We'll see you again soon.